All right, this is chapter 13, types of data collection techniques. The first thing we talk about is standardized versus investigator-developed instruments. So you can use someone else's materials, like their surveys, for your studies. If for some reason you need to create a new measurement, you'll have to do it carefully, and it needs to have reliability and validity. And if you do not remember, reliability is the consistency of the measurement over time, and validity is it measuring what it says it's measuring. So measures can be reliable, that means consistent over time, but not necessarily valid, because if they don't actually measure what they're supposed to measure, then that won't be valid. So you can have a measure that is reliable but not valid. You have to have both. A lot of measurements out there have good reliability and validity already, so if you can use one of those, you probably should. Personally, I'm not going to try to reinvent the wheel if I do not have to. On the researcher observed measures, we're mostly going to talk about direct observations in this section. So the investigator trains observers to observe and record the behaviors of the participants in the studies. Indirect would be interviewing an untrained observer. So maybe you're asking a parent about their kid. That's indirect. You, the investigator, or your research assistants are not actually witnessing the behavior. You're asking someone else secondhand, essentially. Okay, back to the direct. On the naturalness of the setting, a setting that is not controlled or manipulated by the research is going to be a natural setting. So this would be like a school or a playground, etc. A more controlled setting would be a lab that is made to look like the school or the home. And then there's the highly artificial labs, like the physiological laboratory, for instance. The natural settings have more ecological validity, but they sacrifice control. You can't control the environment as well as you could as if you were in a lab. So if you are studying aggression and you watch the kids on the playground and you record the aggressive behaviors, that's a pretty natural setting to do it that way. If you conduct a study like Bandura and the Bobo the doll study, that is going to be much more controlled but less natural. On a side note, qualitative are more likely to use natural settings, and quantitative researchers generally prefer lab studies. Not always, but on average. On the degree of observer participation, basically how aware is the participant that they are being observed. They're strongly going to know that if you bring them into a lab and you're standing over them the entire time. They're going to know they're being observed. It's a little bit less obvious if you bring them into a lab and then you have a one-way mirror where you're able to watch them, but they can't see you. And then, of course, if you're in a natural setting, it's entirely possible that they won't notice you at all. Like if you're at the playground observing the aggression. The kids, they may not see you there. They may not realize that you are observing their behaviors. On the amount of detail and breadth of coverage, basically how much detail and how much about the situation are you trying to record. You might just want to know about aggression, and so you just go in there and record the aggressive behaviors that you see. So that's very, the breadth of that is very small. And the details you may not be recording, what's going on in the background, things of that nature. You're just concerned about aggressive acts. But if you write down everything you see in the scenario, that is going to have more detail and that's going to have more breadth. Moving on to the tests and documents. Sometimes test is used pretty broadly to include things like personality and aptitude. But for this class, for this textbook, when we say test, we are discussing questions with a right or wrong answer. For example, standardized tests. These are tests that follow very specific guidelines, and all participants take the test under the same circumstances. Most standardized tests will have a manual. In standardized tests, there is a specific procedure to follow to administer the test. With many standardized tests, the scores are translated into like a normed score that can be compared to other participants who've also taken the tests. And these are called norm referenced tests. Tests that have scores compared to a norm group or a typical group that is similar to the test taker, so that performance on that test can be compared to other test takers' scores. And you are aware of a standardized test like this. It'd be an IQ test. So it's normed so that 100 is the mean and then 15 is the standard deviation. These are typically considered objective tests. A lot of the time, they are multiple choice tests, which are objective. Essay tests are a bit more subjective because the answer has to be interpreted by the scorer. There's no interpretation on a multiple choice test. On achievement tests, these are used a lot in schools. Basically, are they learning what they are supposed to learn? Obviously, these need to be reliable and valid. You might have one achievement test that's reading, writing, math. Maybe it's just one of those. You could also have very specific achievement tests like a test over just biology. On performance and authentic assessments, So when the investigator observes an individual's performance on a certain task and judges the product based on some criteria. These are going to be more common in things like music or arts, where you need to be able to produce something like a painting or play the piano, produce a piece of music. On aptitude tests, these used to be called intelligence tests. They measure general performance or problem-solving abilities. You're applying knowledge to several different types of situations. And one of the most commonly used, you've probably heard of this too, is the Stanford-Binet, and it produces an IQ score that we mentioned a little bit ago. On collecting data, you can also use documents. So you can collect data through documents like historical records, newspapers. One of the examples from the textbook is if you were collecting students' GPAs. You could go to the administration and get everybody's GPAs. And the advantage to that is you know that it's going to be precise and accurate. If you ask a student for their GPA, it might not be as precise and it might not be as accurate either. Okay, on self-report measures, the first one is standardized personality inventories. These are standardized tests that measure some trait or characteristic of personality. With these, a participant will read a number of statements and indicate how reflective it is of them. An example from the text is the state trait anxiety scale, and so they'll answer questions like, I am calm, I am tense. It's called personality, but it may include tests that investigate things like what job you would want to do, like a vocation type test, your temperament, your motivation. So it includes more than just basically personality. These tests are standardized because they've been given to a lot of people and have reliability and validity. On the attitude scales, Likert, you probably heard of this too. It's a method developed by Likert. It's a way of measuring attitudes, particular about groups, institutions, concepts. So you might have a scale on social responsibility. Maybe it's 10 questions long. Each question goes from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So you might have, depends on what study you're looking at, but it could have 5, it could have 7. So in the 5, it's going to be strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree. You could add the slightly agree and slightly disagree in there to make it 7 if you would like. You add up the score. Some of those questions you might reverse score so that you can tell that the participant is paying attention. So in one question, you're going to word it in like a positive way. In one question, you would word it in a negative way, so that if they believe this one, then they're going to have to put it at the opposite ends. They'll have to put strongly agree on one and they'll have to put strongly disagree on the other one to make sure that they're paying attention. It's a check. And that's the Likert scale. There is an example of what I'm talking about on page 224 if you would like to look over that. On questionnaires, basically you will get a sample of participants. You'll ask a series of questions related to a topic, and what you're trying to do with their responses is make inferences about the whole population. With questionnaires, usually using closed-ended questions, so there are a few responses to pick from. But those responses are locked in, kind of like the strongly agree to strongly disagree. Those are closed-ended because they can only choose, they have to choose one of the choices that you've already put in there. With interviews, it's more common to have open-ended questions. Basically like, what are your thoughts on this person that's running for office? That's open-ended because they can go anywhere with their answer. If you asked them, what are your thoughts? And then you gave them that Likert scale, then those would be closed-ended. Like if you said, this is a good candidate, and you had the responses of yes and no, that's closed-ended. But if you ask, what are your opinions on this person running for office? It's an open-ended question. They're going to go all over the place with those answers, which, depending on what you're trying to do with your research, could be a good thing. Maybe you're just trying to get a pulse and to see what the majority of people think. And by having that open-ended question, you might get a better idea of what a lot of people think. And then also you might see some key terms that'll pop up frequently. On the questionnaires, there are 3 ways to conduct them. There's mailed questionnaires. So you'll send a survey with a stamped return addressed envelope. The response rate is usually pretty low. Also, I haven't even seen one of these in quite some time. I haven't had one mailed to me anyways. The response is usually going to be low. And who is going to respond to this? So if it's only, if only like 5% of people are responding to this, it's possible that 5% that is responding is unique and they are not going to be representative of the population that you're trying to look at. So something to think about. Internet questionnaires, instead of mailing, you have them do it over the internet. This is much more popular nowadays. SurveyMonkey, probably taking a survey over with SurveyMonkey. It's cheaper, so you don't have to do the stamps, you don't have to mail it, and you don't have data entry mistakes. So they send you back the surveys and you would have to hand enter all their responses. I used to do that when I first started doing research, and it was cumbersome. But if you just have them fill out a survey over the internet, or even if you bring them to the lab, you have them do it on the computer, there's no data entry issues with that. And then there is directly administered questionnaires. So you do it in person. maybe in a classroom, maybe like I said, you bring them to a lab, you're going to have a much higher response to this. So if you bring them into your lab and say, here, please do this survey, most people are going to go ahead and do it. But if you send them a letter, a lot of people are just going to throw that away. On the types of questionnaire items, again, open-ended, these questions are very demanding for the participants because they have to think and they have to write out a lot. And then when you're looking at the data, it's hard to compare answers between participants. It's going to take a long time to try to code those entries because maybe you're going to code how many times this one word is said. That's something that's going to take a long time to do. There are some computer programs that can do it nowadays, though. One positive to these, the open-ended questions, is you might not have enough info for a series of closed-ended questions. So you might do a bunch of open-ended questions to try to probe and to try to find out what might make for good closed-ended questions to ask people in the next study. You're working towards creating a pilot study. Partially open-ended questions. These are closed-ended questions, so it might just be the Likert scale questions or just a yes or no, and then underneath that would be a comment box. And then closed-ended unordered. This is for questions that fit the nominal categories, and so the responses do not fall on a continuum. And then the closed-ended ordered questions, it's like the Likert scale. They do fall on some type of a continuum. All right, on interviews, the book lists 2 types of interviews. There's telephone and face-to-face. I'm guessing Zoom should probably be included in that nowadays. You might do an interview to go more in depth on a topic with individuals. And this is, a lot of the times, this is going to be for qualitative studies. And then finally, focus groups. These are going to be similar to interviews, just more people. So you might have 10 people come to your focus group, then you're going to kind of do interviews with them as a group. These can be helpful to get a baseline for your research topic and could maybe be helpful in creating a structured survey or potential interviews for one-on-one interviews. All right, that is it for Chapter 13. Thank you very much for listening.